Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the rhetorical analysis close read. So we talked about the outline, we talked about all the rhetorical devices you probably need to know. We even talked about why purpose and audience are most important. So all of those 3 days of prep have prepared us to actually dive into a reading, which we are going to do for the first time today. So this is going to be a little bit longer of a presentation, so please make sure you're taking time as you go through it, but hopefully there'll be some valuable information here for you. Okay, first we're going to go through the goal of what it's like to go through a close reading, what you're looking for, talk about the process, the things you want to be aware of as you go in that might jump out or that you want to be prepared for. And then we'll talk about a new AP prompt together before you get a chance later in today's lesson to look at one on your own. And then really quickly cover transitioning to the outline. All right, so the goal here is just very simply to effectively identify the necessary information that you need to put in your essay or your outline. And so the goal is not to read every word necessarily. It's not just to have a perfect understanding of everything. When we tend to read these in class, we tend to go into a ton of detail about all the different rhetorical choices because I want you all to be aware of what they are. However, in today's lesson, we want to start to shift towards what is the most important stuff you need to do, because in a 45-minute time session, you're just not going to have as much time to dig into every little minute detail. But we want to talk about what you can really spend your time on. Now, don't forget, the blurb at the top of the page is so important. It is so important. Many people skip over it because it's the test and, oh no, I have to start reading. But you got to start with the blurb. It'll give you hopefully, most of the information, which takes us to our next bullet point, which is SASPA first. You have to understand the purpose and the audience. Oftentimes, this will be given to you in the blurb, so once again, don't forget it. And remember, all of your rhetorical devices have to connect back to the audience and purpose. It doesn't do you any good to find a metaphor or an analogy or syntax if you can't explain how that syntax actually impacts the audience. And so don't just find them. Make sure that you are finding ones that connect to the audience and purpose. And once you have them, start writing. You don't need to read every specific detail and find every single one before you start writing. It's 45 minutes. Choose the ones that stand out the most to you and start writing. Also, don't forget to breathe. Just because you don't recognize everything right away doesn't mean that you won't get there. Every single one that I've ever looked at, I've always been like, oh no, what is there? I don't, oh, wait, here's one. And then eventually you will start to see exactly the choices the author is making. So take a deep breath and really take your time, because if you stick with it, they will show up and you will be able to find them. Okay, so the process, we just talked through a little bit of this, but basically read the blurb. You're looking for speaker, audience, occasion, subject, purpose, all of those things. Start at the beginning. It might be a good idea to actually scan for ideas after you have read the blurb. Sometimes reading the first sentence of each paragraph actually helps you to kind of organize where things are at. Personally, I like to read for a while, once I really feel grounded in the beginning, then sometimes later after I feel grounded in the beginning, I scan okay, what's in the middle, what's at the end, just so I know where it's going. But ultimately, those are all things that you can choose to do or not to do, whatever works best for you. And remember, note the rhetorical devices, but never forget that they have to connect back to the audience and the purpose. So if you're noting and annotating rhetorical devices as you go, it doesn't do you good to write one down unless you can figure out how it connects to the impact on the audience. A couple things just to look for. You could look for perspective. Sometimes if it's a speech in particular, the author or speaker will use I, and then they will switch to we, or sometimes they'll use we instead of I, or sometimes they'll even use you or they. And so if you use these perspective or point of view words, sometimes it can help to connect to, are they trying to connect to the audience? Are they not trying to connect to the audience? Do they feel like they are a part of the audience? It's a really easy way to gain credibility to just say, oh, we are in this together. And so the use of we usually links to credibility. And so if you see that early on, that's a nice, easy paragraph to write about how the author uses we to gain credibility from the audience. Juxtaposition. Juxtaposition is probably the most common one outside of the ones that have to be there, syntax and diction, because those exist simply when people are writing or talking. So Juxtaposition, what ideas are being placed close together, what is the impact of those ideas on the audience, and how do they create this impression. And so juxtaposition, can't say it enough, usually they're usually the most common. Okay, as I mentioned before, the beginning of each paragraph, some of the phrases or ideas might be repeated. If they are, you're looking for repetition there, and it helps you to kind of figure out like when one section begins and when another one ends, and that can kind of help you to figure out the organization of the overall piece, which may hint towards the purpose or the audience if you haven't gotten those yet. And so, just scanning the beginning of each paragraph can sometimes be helpful. And then what can the occasion tell you? Sometimes, like the one we're going to look into in a second, the occasion is actually something that's very specific. If someone is delivering a eulogy, for example, which is a speech that's given at a funeral, it's probably going to be, their purpose is probably going to be comforting the audience and the people who knew the departed best. So definitely a good idea to really think about what the occasion can tell you. Are we in the middle of a crisis? Is there a war happening when they gave this speech or when they wrote this letter? If they're addressing soldiers going to war, like we looked at earlier last week with those videos, they're trying to inspire them to fight because justice is on their side, or they will have freedom, or whatever it is. And so the occasion really can help you sometimes figure out what the purpose is even before you jump into the reading. And last thing before we jump into the prompt, why this audience? Like, why is it this? What is it about this audience that they would need to hear? Is there any specific diction or allusions being used because they're this audience? And how might those be different if it were for a different audience? So all things to consider as you are reading. All right, so we're already about 7 minutes in, and we're just getting to the prompt. And so, like I said, we're actually going to take this step by step and go through the prompt, each part. I'm going to give you a little space and time to kind of read it and think on your own, but feel free to pause the video, ask yourself, what would I put before continuing on and seeing what I am actually doing here. We can't do like stop pair shares, but go ahead and stop the video, think to yourself at different points, and then move forward. And I'll try and signal that as we go through. So the blurb, really quickly. It says, on June 11th, 2004, Margaret Thatcher, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, delivered the following eulogy to the American people in honor of former United States President Ronald Reagan, with whom she had worked closely. Read the eulogy carefully, then in a well-developed essay, analyze the rhetorical strategies that Thatcher uses to convey her message. And so that last sentence is always the same. That one you don't really have to read. However, all the rest of the information is important. So pause the video right now. Check and see what you think each part is of SOSPA. Okay, so let's go over the first part first. So the speaker, the occasion, and the subject. We've got Margaret Thatcher here. We're talking at Ronald Reagan's funeral, of course, because she's giving a eulogy, which means the speech that you give when somebody has just passed away. And most likely the subject here is going to be Ronald Reagan's life and achievements, because that is typically the subject at a funeral. Okay, as far as purpose and audience, you can assume here that the purpose is going to be to honor Ronald Reagan because he's just died, and most likely to comfort his friends and family and the admirers who are there present, because once again, this is the audience is those at the funeral. And so you can assume a lot based on this first part. And so good to keep in mind that those are the things we're probably looking for. You don't necessarily need to write those in stone yet, but we've got a pretty good idea. It would be shocking if it was, for example, to disgrace Ronald Reagan. That wouldn't be the time or place, and would be considered very out of touch. Okay, so let's get started. Lines 1 through 15. We have lost a great president, a great American, and a great man, and I have lost a dear friend. In his lifetime, Ronald Reagan was such a cheerful and invigorating presence that it was easy to forget what daunting historic tasks he set himself. He sought to mend America's wounded spirit, to restore the strength of the free world, and to free the slaves of communism. These were causes hard to accomplish and heavy with risk, yet they were pursued with almost a lightness of spirit, for Ronald Reagan also embodied another great cause, what Arnold Bennett, once called the great cause of cheering us all up. His policies had a freshness and optimism that won converts from every class and every nation, and ultimately from the very heart of the evil empire. Okay, so at this point, if you're playing along at home, go ahead and pause the video. Take a look. What rhetorical devices do you see in the passage, and how do they connect back to what might be the audience and how the audience is being impacted? By the way, evil empire, the annotation right there, is a reference to what Ronald Reagan used to call the Soviet Union during the communism. If you've, remember McCarthyism from any of your history classes, this is very much tied up in that kind of anti-communist idea. Okay, so things that jumped out to me. I saw, first of all, repetition in the very first sentence. We've lost a great president, great American, great man. Great is repeated to really emphasize that. You can really easily tell how an audience might be comforted that this person is calling Ronald Reagan great. We also have a perspective shift from we to I. So we have lost this, we have lost this, we have lost this, and I have lost a dear friend. That really highlights her close relationship with the president, and so probably gaining credibility with the audience because she is, saying he was all these things, but he was also just a good friend to me, which not only would cheer them up, but would also really get a lot of credibility because they were friends. And then last but not least, we've got a lot of juxtaposition here. And so he sought to amend America's wounded spirit and to restore strength. And so wounded spirit, restore strength, juxtaposition right there. He had a cheerful and invigorating presence with daunting historical tasks in front of him. Both of those contrasts show that even though the world was difficult and the world was tough, and the things that he set out to accomplish were extremely, the word that's used here is daunting. He had a cheerful perspective. He was a happy person, and he went out of his way to cheer other people up. And so that juxtaposition tells you a lot about him. He's the type of person who can definitely see the positive and be a light in the darkness. And of course, something like that would cheer up and comfort the audience. And so never forget, how does it connect to audience and purpose? Lines 16 through 29. Yet his humor often had a purpose beyond humor. In the terrible hours after the attempt on his life, his easy jokes gave reassurance to an anxious world. They were evidence that in the aftermath of the terror and in the midst of hysteria, one great heart, at least, remained sane and jocular. They were truly grace under pressure, and perhaps they signified grace of a deeper kind. Ronnie himself certainly believed that he had been given back his life for a purpose. As he told a priest after his recovery, "Whatever time I've got left now belongs to the big fella upstairs." And surely, it is hard to deny that Ronald Reagan's life was providential when we looked at what he achieved in the 8 years that followed. So take a second, pause. What rhetorical devices do you see, and how do you see them connecting back to the audience and purpose? Okay, so one thing that jumped out right away is diction, word choice. Choosing to call him Ronnie is very familiar, and once again underlines this idea that she is close to him. And so that's the second time I've seen it. He was my dear friend. I called him Ronnie. It really underlines the credibility she's gaining with his audience, and how well that she knew him. And so I'm seeing it for the second time, which means maybe that's something I want to consider writing about, because I can pull two pieces of evidence right away. Now, going beyond that, there's almost like this very reverent, a ton of respect in the word choice she's using, and almost like religious even in nature. And so not only is she saying grace under pressure, but she's saying maybe grace of a deeper kind, which kind of hints at religion. And he's talking to a priest later. He says his life belongs to the fellow upstairs. And then the word providential is literally like almost like ordained by God. And so that makes me feel like maybe she's talking to an audience that believes in a God, in Christianity, and that she's kind of using those words to help reassure them that he lived a life that was not only outstanding but it was the one that God had it intended. And she's also using a quote, like a Reagan quote, to kind of use with the crowd. That is not its own kind of rhetorical device, but it is something you can write about. If you wanted to say that like she uses Ronald Reagan quotes during the eulogy, that would be just as good as saying uses a simile. So all of those things are equal, and if you notice them, sometimes you can just describe them. You don't have to worry about what the rhetorical device is, but she's using an actual Reagan quote, which once again underlines her credibility. Okay, lines 30 through 39. Others prophesied the decline of the West. He inspired America and its allies with renewed faith in their mission of freedom. Others saw only limits to growth. He transferred a stagnant economy into an engine of opportunity. Others hoped, at best, for an uneasy cohabitation with the Soviet Union. He won the Cold War, not only without firing a shot, but also by inviting enemies out of their fortresses and turning them into friends. So take a second, pause the video. What are you seeing? Okay, so what jumped out to me is this combination of repetition and juxtaposition, and if you wanted to call it syntax, you could, but basically others said this, Reagan did this. Others saw this, Reagan did this. Others hoped for this, Reagan did this. And so we've got this very clear comparison that's happening through juxtaposition, and the juxtaposition is set up, of course, through the repetition of others, and with the syntax and how the paragraphs are set up. I want to point out that it really does a good job of showing how he was different, which is, of course, going to link back to the purpose, because we're comforting the family and friends, and at the same time honoring him as a leader. He is also, I want to highlight the he turned enemies into friends. That is a nice little clip of juxtaposition too, but hopefully we're picking up on these types of things as we're going through. Okay, lines 40 through 53. I cannot imagine how any diplomat or any dramatist could improve on his words to Mikhail Gorbachev at the Geneva summit. Let me tell you why it is that we distrust you. Those words are candid and tough, and they cannot have been easy to hear, but they are also a clear invitation to a new beginning and a new relationship that would be rooted in trust. We live today in the world that Ronald Reagan began to reshape with those words. It is a very different world with very different challenges and new dangers. All in all, however, it is one of greater freedom and prosperity, one more hopeful than the world he inherited on becoming president. So take a second, pause it. What do you see? Okay. Definitely saw an anecdote here, a short story with a point, not something we've talked about as far as one of the most common rhetorical devices, but an anecdote short story here about something he did. And then, of course, the quote itself. Let me tell you why it is we distrust you. It's very straightforward and candid as she describes, and it says a lot about who he is as a person. He was not the type of person to mince words. He was not the type of person to talk around things. He was direct. He was honest, even when it was difficult, and that is really going to be comforting information for the people who want to honor Ronald Reagan and honor his life. Okay, lines 54 through 81. As Prime Minister, I worked closely with Ronald Reagan for 8 of the most important years of all our lives. We talked regularly, both before and after his presidency, and I've had time and cause to reflect on what made him a great president. Ronald Reagan knew his mind. He had firm principles, and I believe right ones. He expounded them clearly. He acted upon them decisively. When the world threw problems at the White House, he was not baffled or disoriented or overwhelmed. He knew almost instinctively what to do. When his aides were preparing option papers for his decision, they were able to cut out entire rafts of proposals that they knew the old man would never wear. When his allies came under Soviet or domestic pressure, they could look confidently to Washington for firm leadership. And when his enemies tested American resolve, they soon discovered that his resolve was firm and unyielding. Yet his ideas, so clear, were never simplistic. He saw the many sides of truth. Yes, he warned that the Soviet Union had an insatiable drive for military power and territorial expansion, but he also sensed that it was being eaten away by systemic failure impossible to reform. Yes, he did not shrink from denouncing Moscow's evil empire, but he realized that a man of goodwill might nonetheless emerge from within its dark corridors. So take a second. What are you seeing in the passage? And we'll talk about it soon. All right, so I saw a lot here. I mean, there's syntax choices, about shorter and longer sentences. There's a lot of great description, but really, this is kind of just explaining like his achievements and the qualities that he had as president, and the challenges he faced both, as president and in the United States and from overseas. And so it's really just kind of describing his achievements and his qualities. And so if you wanted to write a paragraph where you talked about, in the middle, Margaret Thatcher describes Ronald Reagan's achievement. What impact does that have on the audience? That would be another way to actually go about writing a pretty solid paragraph. Lines 82 through 98. So the president resisted Soviet expansion and pressed down on Soviet weakness at every point until the day came when communism began to collapse beneath the combined weight of those pressures and its own failures, and when a man of goodwill did emerge from the ruins. President Reagan stepped forward to shake his hand and offer sincere cooperation. Nothing was more typical of Ronald Reagan than that large-hearted magnanimity, and nothing was more American. Therein lies, perhaps, the final explanation of his achievements. Ronald Reagan carried the American people with him in his great endeavors because there was perfect sympathy between them. He and they loved America and what it stands for: freedom, opportunity for ordinary people. So, take a second. What do you see? All right, so the diction at the end here really stands out. It's heroic and American. The fact that he has large-hearted magnanimity. The fact that he has this freedom, this love of freedom in America, opportunity for ordinary people. It's very, very American, and also very heroic when he's not only willing to help bring down the evil, but willing to help pick up the country of the Soviet Union when someone stepped forward with a good faith agreement to try and build better things. There's also a little bit of symbolism tied in here. He carried the American people. Of course, he's not actually carrying anyone, but his leadership actions, she believes, did. And so overall, those are probably the things that you want to see on a close read as you're looking through. This was not all inclusive, so there could have been other things, but those are kind of the higher level ones that'll probably jump out. Okay, so when you're transitioning to the outline, I want to acknowledge, first of all, that was a lot. There were a lot of different things that you could have pulled from that reading in order to write about, but you just need to write about the ones that are going to help you explain how the audience is impacted and how it works toward the purpose. So don't feel like you have to write in every single little thing. Think about which ones really stood out that you're able to really explain how the audience was impacted. So for the beginning, maybe perspective is a good thing to use. Talking about, diction and the word choice between I and we in that first paragraph, and that might help, talk about how the audience is going to come to a better understanding of her and get more credibility or ethos. She's going to have more ethos because she's used those words. You could even, throw in Ronnie from line 23 to help support this. That gives you two pieces of evidence to write about, which is always good to cite from more than one place. So even if you're only writing about one rhetorical device, if you can find two instances of it in the beginning, middle, or end, that might help. So for the beginning section, this might be a way to start. Then for the middle, what really stood out to me was that repetition and juxtaposition, allowing Margaret Thatcher to illustrate how unique Ronald Reagan was. through others would do this, he would do this, others would do this, he would do this. I think that really stands out and would make the audience feel like Ronald Reagan was a truly unique person and deserved to be honored and feel comforted that, even if he's gone, he lived the best possible life. And then last but not least, maybe diction would be a good one to use at the end to show how Reagan has been a leader and an American hero throughout the world. And so maybe diction would be something to choose at the end. Whatever you choose, though, just remember that you need to be comfortable explaining how it connects to the audience and how the audience is impacted. So if you find something and you feel good about it, and you understand how it connects to the author's impact on the audience, sounds like something you can write about. So I know that was a lot, but definitely want you to have this to refer back to as we go through into our future readings. All right, so if you've got any questions, please feel free to reach out. As always, my internet is back working, so it should be more readily available via email, but also call or text work as well. So hope you're doing well. Hope the family and everyone is okay. Have a good one, and I'll see you soon.